When I was little, my parents told me bedtime stories, but their stories were different from ordinary fairy tales. They were ominous tales, warnings of monsters lurking in dark corners, ready to snatch away bad kids like me. Their whispers were like shadows crawling into my room, and the quieter they spoke, the scarier I became. Sometimes they would even turn off the lights, leaving me alone in the darkness to catch my breath and hear the silence build up. I couldn't sleep, imagining that someone was lurking right behind me, waiting for my fear. By the time I was 8, I couldn't be alone with these fears. I hid the flashlight under my pillow as a protection. My parents didn't know, and it was a small piece of freedom in their world of inhibitions. But when I turned 12, they took it away. They stopped letting me even one step out of the house after 8 in the evening, locked the windows, and locked the door to my room from the outside. They kept saying it was for my protection, but I knew it wasn't fear for me. It was punishment for something I didn't understand. They said that monsters only come for those who deserve it, and every time I heard those words, an unbearable chill enveloped me. One night I heard something scrabbling just outside my window. My heart sank. I crept to the glass, barely breathing. The scraping stopped, but as soon as I took a step away from the window, the sound came from the walls again. I stayed under the covers all night, shivering and trying not to move. In the morning, I broke up. In time, the scraping behind the walls turned into something much more frightening, a whisper, quiet and jerky, like words coming from the other side of the abyss. The sound came through the walls, seemed to seep from beneath the floor, from the shadows behind the door, from the very air in my room. The voice called my name over and over every night, and I lay there, unable to move, feeling the voice reaching for me, piercing the darkness. At first, I tried to hide the fear, to suppress it, but with each night the anxiety grew. It was as if my parents were enjoying my condition. Their gazes became strange, detached, as if I was a stranger in their home. They looked at me, but saw something different, as if it wasn't my face, but a shadow behind me, something lurking. "It's what you deserve." I heard their quiet voices sounding like a sentence whenever I tried to talk about my fear or share the eerie feelings of the night. One day, I overheard my parents talking when they thought I was asleep. They were whispering, the words sounding like the splash of ice water, chilling me to the bone. They were discussing something about ceremony, repeating the word with a peculiar expression, as if it were some forbidden ritual they only discussed at night. Father repeated that it is necessary that she should be silent, and added that, otherwise it will be worse. Every word they said cast new shadows in my mind, as if they weren't talking about some game, but about preparing for something inevitable. I wanted to ask them what they meant, but my gut stopped me, as if even the thought of looking them in the eye after this conversation was something dangerous. A few days later, my mother handed me an old, dust-covered mirror with a dark wood frame covered in a network of small cracks. Her face was impassive, but something akin to anticipation flashed in her eyes. "Put it by your bedside this night," she said in a quiet, cold voice. "You'll see who's been watching you all this time." The words echoed in me like heavy footsteps in an empty hallway. I didn't understand why she was asking me to do this, but not obeying seemed even more frightening. That night, trembling, I set the mirror by the headboard. It was directly across from me, and every corner of the room was reflected in it. At first, nothing happened. The silence was so thick that it seemed as if the world around me had disappeared, leaving me alone. But at exactly midnight, the silence was pierced by a familiar scraping sound, like claws digging into the walls, only now it was louder, more insistent, penetrating every corner. Then the voices began, no longer quiet and intermittent, but hoarse, eerie, like a snake hissing into my ears. They shouted my name over and over with increasing anger and madness. I clenched my eyes shut, unable to hold back the tears. But finally, I slowly opened my eyes and stared into the mirror. And in the reflection, I saw a figure standing behind me. It was almost invisible, but through the darkness, I could make out something humanoid, tall and menacing, standing over me. It had no eyes. It had dark, empty gaps instead, and yet it was staring straight at me. I felt that gaze with my whole body, and the second it did, it smiled, but the expression on its face was frighteningly familiar. The smile grew wider, turning into a frightening grin that made my blood run cold in my veins, and a voice so similar to my mom's sounded in my ears that it sounded like she was speaking. "You deserve it." With an icy dread, I sprinted out of the room and ran to my parents' bedroom, pounding as hard as I could on the closed door, screaming, begging for it to open. Opening the door, my parents looked at me as if they had been waiting for this moment. Mom, calm, looked at me with a look in which I didn't see an ounce of surprise or alarm, and said, "Well, did you see something interesting?" I was terrified. I was shaking and scarcely restraining my tears. I asked, "What are you doing to me?" But my parents continued to look at me with the same cold calm, and then my mom sighed softly, as if I was about to hear a long-awaited confession. "Honey, it's not us," she said in a soft, chilling voice. "We're not the ones who hurt you." Before I could react in any way, she took me firmly by the arm and, as if leading me one last time into the depths of a dark forest, led me back into the room. There she stopped and said, almost in a whisper, "Look in the mirror again." With a sinking heart, I did it, against all instincts. At first, I saw only my reflection, but the longer I stared, the more strange details I noticed. The dark shadow looming behind me began to take on a clearer shape. This time, it was as if the truth itself stood before me. The creature with the empty eye sockets wasn't just standing behind me, it was my reflection. I began to notice subtle features that were frighteningly familiar. I was looking at myself, but at the same time, at something else. Suddenly, memories came rushing back like the thunderclap before the storm. Fragments of nights when I heard someone crying and then realized it was mine. Memories of bruises on my mother's body that she attributed to my antics, but I never believed her. And something larger, sinister, suddenly became crystal clear. It wasn't a monster hiding in my house. I was the monster, a creature of shadows and silence that lurked in my own reflection. I heard my voice from the depths of the mirror, and it sounded like a hate-filled echo. "You deserve it." At that moment, the mirror cracked, and the crack traveled across my entire reflection, as if tearing me apart. A flash of pain rippled through the memories of things I had once forgotten, horrible deeds as if buried in the back of my mind. My reflection looked back at me with such a cruel grin that I realized all these years my parents had been afraid of me because I was the one they whispered about in the dark. The mirror shattered, and with the sound of shattering shards, I realized a truth I couldn't escape.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel. There are a lot of interesting stories waiting for you.